Did you hear that? This is the way we are to live together. If you're a follower of Jesus, that is the way we are to be. Do you remember the old-time horror movies? I mean really old-time, from like the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, from the 20th century. And here is the thing about those old-time horror movies. They're not scary. And that's wonderful. Vincent Price, Boris Karloff, Lon Chaney. It wasn't really that scary. It was more cheesy than terrifying, more kitsch than frightening, and it was wonderful. I mean, back then in those old-time horror movies, zombies just kind of walked around very sleepily. They just looked like me before my first cup of coffee. But now, zombies are like these brain-eating jaguars that pounce upon you. But back then, they just strolled around. I think Ephesians 4 is about some of those old-time monsters. I mean, the ones that weren't scary. I think Ephesians 4 is actually about vampires, werewolves, and zombies. Again, not the scary ones. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But first, I want to give a little Bible teaching. I want to teach you about what's called parenesis. You see, when you go to seminary to become a minister, you get trained in a lot of jargon. You know, every field has this. You get trained in all these words that nobody else uses. So you come out of seminary and you say things like eschatology, soteriology, ontology, and parenesis is one of those words you learn in seminary. Now I'm going to teach you. It won't do you that much good. You'll never use the word again, but parenesis. In seminary, you learn that in Paul's epistles, the letters he's writing to the early Christians, he includes often a section of basic moral exhortation. And I mean really basic, amicable, conventional things like don't lie, don't steal, treat each other kindly, don't be filled with bitterness, work hard, live a good life, like Ephesians 4 here. Parenesis is what the ancient philosophers did, and Paul is copying this. Parenesis is a basic moral teaching. And the ancient Greek philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, they would go into these sections where they would say those most basic things. Be nice to each other. Because you see, these ancient philosophers, they thought that if you actually believed their ideas, it would change the way you live. See, I know when I say philosophy, you think that's about a set of intellectual ideas. But philosophy, most fundamentally, is about a way of living. All the ancient philosophers thought this was a way of life, what they were teaching. And so they would engage in parenesis, these sections of basic teaching. Now, Paul is transposing that a little in his letters. Now he's saying, if you're a follower of Jesus, this would be how you live. This is how he's using parenesis. If you say you're following Jesus, this is how your life should look. That's parenesis. Now, what parenesis is trying to do most fundamentally is root out hypocrisy. So that, like, hypocrisy is when you say you believe one thing, but you never live it out. It's that your actions don't fit what you espouse. So parenesis is trying to make sure there's an integrity. If we're gathering here and saying we're following Jesus, then it would show itself in these kind of ways, the ways we treat one another with a special gentleness and grace. So parenesis is trying to create an integrity. Do what you say. Live your ideals. I'm going to Matthew 23 right now, because if there was one thing that made Jesus livid, this totally triggered Jesus. The one thing? Hypocrisy. It was hypocrisy that just lit him up. If he saw particularly religious people, if they were being hypocritical, that was his trigger. In Matthew 23, you got to go check out Matthew 23 this afternoon. He launches into this diatribe against the religious leaders he thinks are being hypocritical. Now, if you come to church and the scripture readers reading this passage, they read it in that church tone. They'll say, "Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside you are full of greed. Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs. On the outside you look beautiful, but on the inside you are rotting." But that's not how Jesus would have been speaking. He was mad. Now, he didn't sin in his madness. He never hurt anyone, but he would get mad. And here, you can't really read it the way he was saying it in church, because it would just be like so in your face. "Woe to you, scribes, you Pharisees, you hypocrites! You're rotting inside, but outside," he just is yelling, right? That doesn't work in church. I'm done with that. It was hypocrisy. And parenesis is trying to root hypocrisy out. Do you know, if you ask a young person in America about why they don't go to church, if you ask a young person that happens not to go to church, you ask them why, the number one most common reason is they think religion is hypocritical. Most common reason. As an outsider, if they haven't been around churches, they hear churches talk about being gentle and loving and non-judgmental, and then they see churches being mean to gay people or people that are different. And that looks like such a hypocrisy. They go, what they don't know, this is ironic, is they're being totally Jesus-y. They're being just like Jesus. That's exactly what made him mad too. But they'll look at churches, and if you haven't been part of a church, they'll see churches talk in language that sounds holier than thou, like we think we've got it all together and that we're superior. Now, if they were coming to church, once you're here, we're not being holier than thou. We know we're screwed up, right? We're not being righteous. We're being aspirational. We're striving towards those goals. But we know we don't live it out every day. If you're in church, you know that. But if you're an outsider, you don't see that. If you're here in church, I only use aspirational language. You will never hear me say, for example, that First-Plymouth is an inclusive church. You will hear me say we are striving to be inclusive. Because we'll fall short. We know that. Or you'll never hear me say that First-Plymouth is an anti-racist church. You will hear me say it's our dream to become anti-racist. But if you're an outsider, it can all sound a little hypocritical. I get that. So parenesis is Paul's effort to make sure we're living what we say as best we can. Okay, that's the Bible teaching. Now, Ephesians 4, I see these old-time horror monsters in this passage, and I mean the non-scary ones. And I see Paul basically saying, don't be a vampire, don't be a werewolf, and don't be a zombie. But I mean the non-scary kinds, but still, those horror monsters of the past, they weren't scary, but they had issues. They had a lot of issues. Like Frankenstein, mostly he was just lonely and had relationship issues, right? Like a vampire in the old-time movies, he wasn't that scary, but he was draining on those around him, right? Right? Like a werewolf, they weren't that scary, but they had anger management issues, right? And I think Paul is saying, don't be a vampire, zombie, werewolf. Again, I mean the non-scary kind. I think Ephesians 4 here is a monster mash. Do you remember that novelty song from the 60s? Yes, Gary Paxton was singing in a nightclub somewhere around 1961, and just as a joke, he fell into a Boris Karloff impersonation, and the crowd ate it up. So he went back to the hotel room, and he wrote a song called the Monster Mash. Do you remember? It goes like this. Was working in my lab late one night. I don't do a good Boris Karloff, but I'm going to try, okay? When my eyes beheld an airy sight, from my monster from his slab began to rise, and suddenly, to my surprise, he did the monster mash. It was a graveyard smash. Do you remember this song? To the master bedroom where the vampires feast, the ghouls all came from their humble abodes to get a jolt from my electrodes. They did the monster mash. Any song that rhymes abode with electrode wins me over right away. Right away. Do you remember this song? And it was one of those novelty songs back when monsters weren't scary. Do you remember that there was a dance? It started with the zombie, but then sort of did a twist. And do you remember this? The monster mash. The BBC banned that song because they thought it was too scary. We are in a different world. But I think I see a monster mash here. In verse number 26, I think he's saying, don't be a werewolf. He says, do not let the sun go down on your anger. Well, exactly what werewolves do is when the sun goes down, they light up, right? They get mad. He's saying, don't carry your anger over into the night. Don't be a werewolf. He doesn't say don't be angry. He says be angry, but don't sin. Don't act out. What a werewolf does is act out on his anger. So don't be a werewolf. You can feel anger. In fact, anger can be a good thing. It's anger that can energize us to fix something, like anger at an injustice. That can galvanize our energy, get us focused. Anger can actually draw people together. If you don't sin and you don't act out on your anger, anger pulls people together to try to work it out. Like in families, you try to work it out. Have you ever been angry at a family member? Ever? Yeah, right? But you've just got to work it out. Anger can be a way that we bond, actually. Be angry, but do not sin. Don't act out in ways that will hurt others. Don't be a werewolf. Well, I think I see in verse 28, he's saying, don't be a zombie. He's saying, make sure that you get up and you work hard through each day. You work honestly and you work hard with your own hands. Zombies, they're not really engaged with life. They just kind of walk around. That's all they do. Old-time zombies. But he's saying here, don't be a zombie. Seize each day. Each day is an opportunity to work hard, love fully, live gracefully. Don't be a zombie. At times, any of us can be a little half alive. Half alive. And he's saying, don't be a zombie. And then in verse 29, I think he's saying, don't be a vampire. He's saying, make sure what comes out of your mouth is building up to others. It increases a sense of mutuality, is upbuilding to them. I've begun to ask myself, and it's hard to self-critique, but I've asked myself in various moments, am I adding to the energy in whatever group I'm in or person I'm with? Am I adding some positivity or am I draining them? Am I taking energy away? Am I negativity in some way? He's saying, don't be a vampire. He doesn't mean you're a bloodsucker. He just means, are you lifting up those around you? I mean, think about that at times. Now, I know you might think I've just reduced Ephesians 4 to a pretty low hurdle. I just said, don't be monsterish. I know that's a pretty low hurdle. So, just step over that hurdle. Try to live each day with a little more grace, a little more kindness. Our God is so great that you will fail in this. It's guaranteed. You're going to express some anger in a hurtful way. It's guaranteed you're going to be draining upon some others. It's guaranteed you will live a day in a way that is just sort of half alive. You will miss an opportunity. You'll just kind of cruise through a day. It's guaranteed. But our God is so great, there'll be another day that God will give you a chance to live more fully, be more kind, be more upbuilding. Do you hear the amazing grace of our God? Today you may not do it, but tomorrow will be this new gift. Let's walk in the way of Christ together. Amen.